The desert had its own way of swallowing sound. Out there, on the training grounds of Fort Armitage, even the roar of boots against dirt seemed to vanish into the open sky. It was the kind of silence that could make you feel small or make you feel like the only thing left that mattered. That morning, I felt like both. Rows of cadets stretched across the field in perfect squares, each movement timed to the bark of a single voice. Major Ellis Kane had a voice built for command, low, sharp, and unforgiving. Every order cracked like a whip, every syllable dragging the cadets tighter into his rhythm. They moved as though their very survival depended on him. Maybe it did. From the bleachers, I could feel the heat rolling up from the dirt, see the sweat catching the sun on the cadets' necks. The visitors around me fanned themselves with programs, muttering about the heat, but I sat still, hands folded on my lap, a picture of patience. A plain blouse, dark slacks, hair pinned neatly at the back of my neck. I had chosen the outfit carefully, neutral, forgettable. I wanted no one to notice me, but invisibility is a fragile gift. It holds until the moment someone decides to look too closely. My sister Clara stood in the front line, chin high, posture locked, her rifle steady against her shoulder. She was everything I was supposed to be, focused, admired, destined to shine. My family's golden child. I let my eyes rest on her for a moment, felt that old tug in my chest, and then turned back to the formation as if she were just another face in the crowd. Major Kane's pacing slowed. I noticed it before anyone else did, the way his boots shifted slightly, his gaze cutting across the formation toward the bleachers. His eyes locked on me. A faint flicker of recognition tightened his jaw. I kept my expression steady. 1 second, 2, 3. He broke formation. The cadets stiffened, unsure if this was part of their drill. The silence rippled outward. Conversations in the bleachers faltered. Heads turned. All eyes followed him as he cut a line straight through the field. I knew this moment was coming. I had just hoped it would not arrive here, not like this, not in front of Clara. When he stopped in front of me, the desert sun carved the edges of his uniform into steel. His voice carried across the training yard, clear and sharp. "Commander Burke, ma'am. I was not informed you would be observing today." The words fell like a stone into a still pond. Whispers ignited instantly, spreading through the bleachers. "Commander." The visitors repeated it as if testing the word for weight, disbelief wrapped in every syllable. "Commander Burke." From the field, I heard a metallic clatter. Clara's rifle had slipped from her grip, striking the ground with a sound that cut sharper than any command. She froze, eyes wide, her entire body trembling with the shock of recognition. Her sister a commander? I rose slowly from my seat, my movements deliberate. The stairs pressed down like 1,000 spotlights, and I carried them as if they weighed nothing at all. "At ease, Major," I said, my voice even. "No announcement necessary. Continue as ordered." For a moment, Kane did not move. Then he lowered his salute, pivoted with perfect precision, and marched back toward the cadets. His boots struck the dirt like thunder. But the drills did not resume right away. The cadets held their rifles stiffly, eyes darting toward me, toward Clara, toward the officer who had just saluted a ghost. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath. I sat back down, folding my hands once more as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Clara stood frozen in formation, her chin still lifted, though the tremor in her jaw betrayed her. I knew that look. I had seen it when we were children, when her perfect picture of the world cracked for the first time. Back then, it was small things. A teacher who was unfair, a friend who betrayed her. But this was different. This was the ground shifting beneath her feet. The lie our family had built around me was unraveling. For years, I had been painted as the failure, the one who walked away when things grew too hard. Clara had lived in my absence, fed on the story of my collapse, her success sharpened against my supposed weakness. But the salute had torn a hole straight through that story. The cadets whispered under their breath. The visitors leaned toward one another, their eyes sliding back to me with suspicion, with curiosity, with awe. And Clara's stare burned hotter than all of them combined. I stayed only long enough to let the rumors take root, long enough to make sure the questions would bloom into doubt. Then I rose, quiet and unnoticed in the noise, and walked down the bleachers. By the time I reached the side gate, the drills had resumed, though the rhythm was off, fractured by the weight of what they had seen. The wind hit me as I stepped out into the desert, dry and sharp, tugging at the hem of my blouse. I pulled in a breath, steadying myself. This was not how I wanted Clara to find out. Not here, not like this. But the shadows I had spent years living in were no longer content to stay still. They had moved, creeping into the light, and there was no pulling them back. For the first time in years, I felt the future pressing against me, urgent and unstoppable. And Clara had just witnessed enough to know that I was not the sister she thought I was. The parking lot behind the base was nearly empty when I reached it. A few dusty cars sat baking under the sun, their hoods shimmering with heat. Mine blended in, just another sedan with no story worth remembering. That was always the trick. Own nothing remarkable, carry nothing traceable, leave no shape that the world could easily outline. I slid behind the wheel, but I did not start the engine. Instead, I sat there in the silence, watching the chain-link fence in the rearview mirror. Beyond it, the cadets' voices rose again, faint but determined, as if they could pound discipline back into the cracks that had just appeared. I touched the inside pocket of my jacket. The device was no bigger than a credit card, its surface smooth and unmarked, humming faintly with a pulse only I could feel. It had not lit up during the salute. Not yet, but I knew it would, because moments like that never went unseen. The last time I had walked away from Clara, it had been in the middle of an argument that left neither of us speaking. She thought I had quit because I was weak. I let her believe it. It was easier than explaining the truth. That quitting was the only way to survive the life that waited on the other side. She had been 16 then, still too young to understand the kind of silence I had chosen. Now she was 22, her name sung in family toasts, her face plastered across graduation slideshows. And she had just watched the man she admired most, Major Ellis Kane, salute the sister she had been taught to pity. There was no undoing that. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. The desert heat pressed against the windows, thick and heavy, but my thoughts were colder. I remembered the first time someone had saluted me, not out of respect, but out of recognition. Recognition that I had signed away my identity, that I had chosen the shadows. There had been no family in the bleachers, no cadets watching. Just a small, windowless room, a contract, and a voice that told me plainly, "From this moment forward, you do not exist." I had believed I could carry that silence forever, that if I buried the truth deep enough, Clara would never stumble into it. I was wrong. The device in my pocket vibrated once. A faint tremor, subtle enough that no one else would notice. My pulse quickened. I pulled it out, shielding the screen from the sunlight. A single message glowed: Observer Protocol. Fort Armitage. Passive assessment. Contact not required. I let out a slow breath. The timing was not coincidence. It never was. The people who sent those directives always knew more than they admitted. They had chosen this base for a reason. And Clara's unit was at the center of it. I started the engine, the hum filling the silence. My hands rested on the wheel longer than they should have, the weight of memory pressing down. Then I shifted into gear and pulled out of the lot, letting the desert road stretch before me. Driving away from the base felt like pulling away from gravity. Every mile I put between myself and those bleachers should have made me lighter. Instead, it felt like chains tightening. Clara's face lingered in my mind, the shock, the disbelief, the questions she had not dared to ask. I knew she would not let it go. Clara had inherited our father's stubbornness, sharpened by our mother's unrelenting pride. She had built her entire identity on being the opposite of me. And now that story had cracked, she would dig until she reached the truth. I could only hope she would not dig too deep. The road stretched endlessly, lined with scrub brush and jagged rocks that cast long shadows across the sand. The sun clung to the horizon, dragging the day into a slow burn. I rolled the window down, letting the wind scrape against my skin. The silence of the desert gave me space to think, but thinking was dangerous. It opened doors I had locked long ago. Faces flickered in my memory, men and women who had vanished into missions no one spoke of, allies who had never been recorded, enemies whose names were erased before they reached the news. I thought of the scars, not the kind that showed on skin, but the kind that sat in the pit of your stomach and whispered at night when the world was too quiet. I thought of the one person who had managed to outmaneuver me. The man whose betrayal had left me standing in front of a tribunal, accused of crimes I had not committed. The one I had believed was gone, buried under layers of silence. Victor Harlow. Even now, the name scraped against me like broken glass. I pressed harder on the accelerator, as if speed could put distance between me and the memory. The desert blurred. By the time I reached the edge of town, the sun had dipped low enough to paint the sky in bruised colors. I parked outside a diner with peeling paint and neon that flickered half-heartedly. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and grease, the kind of place where conversations dissolved into background noise. I chose a booth in the back, facing the door, old habits. The waitress poured coffee without asking. I nodded my thanks, watching her walk away, then pulled the device from my pocket again. The message was still there, glowing faintly, waiting for acknowledgement. Passive assessment. No contact required. That was what they said. But nothing about this was passive. The truth was simple. Clara had seen too much. The salute had planted questions she would not stop asking. And once she started digging, she would find the thing I had kept hidden for nearly a decade. I wrapped my hands around the coffee mug, the warmth grounding me. For years, I had walked a line between silence and survival, but lines never hold forever. Sooner or later, they break. That morning at the base had been the first fracture. And I knew the next would come sooner than I wanted. The invitation did not come with warmth. It never did. It arrived as a text from my mother, 3 words long, "Come home Sunday." No hello, no how are you. Just a directive, like I was still 19 and under her roof, expected to follow without question. Beneath it was an explanation as clipped as a military order, celebration for Clara, wear something normal. I stared at the message for a long while, the phone glowing against my palm, the coffee in front of me growing cold. I had not set foot in that house for nearly 7 years, not since the night I walked out without slamming the door, knowing silence would echo louder than any final word. And yet, I knew I would go, not for them, never for them, for Clara. The drive home was lined with ghosts. Every highway sign pulled at memories I had tried to bury. The summer nights we snuck out to chase fireflies, the winter mornings when frost clung to the windows of our old station wagon, the arguments shouted across the kitchen table until our father's voice slammed them into silence. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was already sliding behind the trees. The place looked the same in all the worst ways. The porch light still flickered, indecisive. The mailbox leaned to the left, bent from some long-forgotten collision. The cracks in the driveway had widened, like fault lines spreading under pressure. Inside, the air was heavy with cinnamon and baked ham. My mother had always believed the smell of food could plaster over the cracks in our family. It never worked. The dining room was dressed like a military banquet. A banner stretched across the far wall, "Congratulations, Lieutenant Clara Burke." Printed programs sat neatly folded on each plate. A slideshow looped on a projector in the corner, flashing images of Clara in uniform, Clara receiving her insignia, Clara saluting with perfect posture. Not one picture of me. I stepped inside quietly, wearing the same plain blouse and slacks I had worn at the base. I had thought about changing, but the truth was simple. I did not want to. To them, I had always been a shadow. Why not dress like one? The first face I saw was my father's. He did not stand. He did not hug me. He barely lifted his eyes from the slideshow. "So," he said, his voice already drifting back toward Clara's face on the wall, "what are you doing these days?" Before I could answer, he launched into a monologue about Clara's recent scores, her promotion, her placement in the top 10% of her class. His voice swelled with pride, and my mother nodded beside him, glass of wine in hand. At the buffet table, my Aunt Kendra smirked. "Didn't you used to play waitress at that chain place?" She asked, loud enough for the room to hear. "Looks like it stuck." A few chuckles followed, polite and sharp all at once. I smiled, small, precise. "I'm better at serving now," I said. My tone was cool enough to sting without raising my voice. The laughter faltered, just for a second. Then came the moment that always slipped in, as predictable as clockwork, the casual dismissal. "Daisy, could you grab some extra forks from the kitchen?" someone asked. "And water, too." No one else moved. No one asked if I minded. It was assumed, always assumed, so I went. The kitchen smelled like spice and old arguments. I opened drawers I still knew by heart, the silverware clinking softly in my hands. I filled glasses at the sink, listening to Clara's laughter drift down the hallway, buoyed by admiration. When I returned, every seat was taken. Name cards lined the table, each place accounted for, except mine. My mother blinked at me as if my presence had caught her by surprise. "There's a folding chair on the porch," she said. "By the grill, you can sit there." So I did. The metal chair was cold beneath me, the wind brushing against my ankles, the smell of propane seeping through the night air. Inside, voices rose and fell like a chorus. Toasts clinked. Clara's name echoed again and again. I sat quietly unseen, but not for long, because the truth has a way of pressing in, no matter how tightly you hold the door shut. The screen door creaked once, and I turned my head. Clara stepped out, her uniform jacket replaced by a sweater, her hair tied back loosely. For a moment, she just stood there, framed in the doorway, watching me with a kind of hesitation I had never seen on her before. Then she sat on the step beside me, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her, but far enough to keep the space between us heavy. "You didn't tell me," she said quietly. Her words were not a question. They were an accusation. I kept my gaze on the dark yard where shadows stretched long across the grass. Tell you what? That you're not who I thought you were. Her voice trembled, the words catching on her throat. Major Kane saluted you, called you commander. What the hell was that? I let the silence hang, long enough for the night to thicken. Finally, I said, sometimes the truth doesn't fit into the stories people want to believe. Her jaw tightened. That's not an answer. No, I said, it is. The screen door opened again, and someone inside called her name. Clara hesitated, caught between the world that adored her and the sister who had just cracked its foundation. She stood slowly, looking down at me as if searching for a version of me she could recognize, but she didn't find it. And then she went back inside, the door shutting behind her, the noise of the party swallowing her whole. I sat in the dark, the cold metal of the chair pressing against me, the weight of the night settling in. I had come for her, and already the cost of that choice was rising. The cold from that folding chair clung to me long after I left it behind. Even as I walked back to my car, I could still feel the bite of the metal against my legs, as if the house itself wanted me to remember my place. Shadows pressed against the porch light, flickering every few seconds like the bulb was as indecisive as the people inside. I drove in silence, the radio off, the night swallowing every sound except the hum of the engine. Houses blurred past, each one lit up with the kind of warmth I had long since stopped expecting from my own family. I told myself I did not care, that I had built a life without them, that their approval was no longer a currency I needed. But lies are easiest when you whisper them to yourself. At the next red light, my phone buzzed. Not a text from family, of course. Not even a name. Just a vibration that traveled straight through me, steady, deliberate. I pulled it from the pocket of my jacket, shielding the glow of the screen with my hand. The device hummed faintly as though it carried its own heartbeat. Observer protocol. Fort Armitage. Node breach suspected. My chest tightened. The words were clear, clinical, stripped of anything human, but I knew what they meant. Someone had touched something they should not have. Someone inside that base had tripped a wire. And I already knew who. Clara. The memory hit instantly, the old gym bag I had handed her last year, tucked with the kind of casualness that could pass as thoughtless. She had accepted it without question, probably assuming it carried nothing but spare clothes and snacks. She had never asked, and I had never offered, but inside that bag was more than fabric and zippers. There was a piece of me, a shard of the life she had been told I abandoned. A flat, brushed steel drive, no branding, no markings, humming with secrets too dangerous for daylight. And now it was awake. The light turned green. I sat there, unmoving, the cars behind me honking impatiently. Finally, I eased forward, my grip on the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. I had always known this day would come. You cannot hide fire forever, not even in steel. The only question had been when. By the time I reached my apartment, the air felt heavier, as though the world itself knew what had been set in motion. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, unlocked the door, and stepped inside without bothering to turn on the lights. Darkness suited me better anyway. I dropped my keys on the counter, pulled the device from my jacket again, and tapped it awake. The message remained, pulsing softly against the screen. Node breach suspected. My mind flashed to Clara, sitting on her bunk at the barracks, her curiosity pulling at the seams of her self-control. I could see her hands trembling as she slid the drive into her tablet, the screen flickering with lines of code she could not possibly understand. I could hear the system's cold response in my head because I had written it years ago, access logged, oversight alert triggered. No menu, no warning, just silence. And now every alarm bell in the buried networks of Echo Shade would be ringing. I set the device down carefully, pressing both palms to the counter as though bracing myself against an earthquake, because that was what this was. An aftershock of a past I had tried to bury. I had left that drive with Clara for one reason only. In case I disappeared, it would be the thread she could pull to find me. But threads can just as easily become tripwires. And tonight, she had found the wrong one. The phone rang. Not the one on the counter, but the secure line hidden in the lining of my jacket. The one no one else knew existed. I answered before the second ring. Commander Burke, a voice said, cold and clipped. Major Evelyn Shaw, she had the kind of tone that could cut glass. I'm listening, I said. We've traced the breach. It originated inside Fort Armitage. Proximity lock engaged on a legacy node. We need your assessment within 48 hours. Silent flag, no official record. I closed my eyes. Legacy node, that was not just any tripwire. That was something older, buried deeper than even Shaw understood. It wasn't me, I said quietly. "That's what worries us," she replied, and then the line went dead. I stood there in the dark, the silence pressing harder now. My hands shook once before I forced them still. Only 2 people on Earth had physical access to that drive. One of them was me, the other was Clara. The weight of it settled like lead in my chest. I walked to the window, pulled the curtain back just enough to see the city lights blinking in the distance. Somewhere out there, my sister was probably sitting awake, staring at the steel drive in her hand, wondering what she had unleashed. I had wanted to keep her safe, to keep her blind to the shadows I lived in. But the truth had teeth, and now they were sinking in. The night stretched long before me, and I knew sleep would not come. Not now, not for a while. Because the shadows I had chosen no longer belonged to me alone, and Clara was already standing in them. The barracks at Fort Armitage never truly slept. Even at night, when most cadets lay collapsed on their bunks, the air buzzed with the residue of drills and shouted orders, with the nervous whispers of those too restless to surrender to sleep. Clara lay awake long after lights out. Her bunkmate snored softly across the room, but Clara's eyes stayed fixed on the gym bag under her bed. She had not looked at it for months, had nearly forgotten it was there, gathering dust along with the old t-shirts and socks she barely touched. But tonight something gnawed at her. The salute. The way Major Kane's voice had carried across the training yard. The way my name, Commander Burke, hung in the air like a weapon. Her world had cracked. And when cracks appear, people go searching for what's on the other side. She pulled the bag out quietly, dragging it onto her bunk, her hands already trembling. She unzipped it, rifling past the clothes, the notebook, the random scraps of nothing, until her fingers found it. The steel drive. It looked ordinary at first glance, brushed silver, flat and clean, small enough to disappear in a pocket. But when she turned it in her hand, the faint etching on its surface caught the dim light. A grid, geometric and sharp, like a pattern meant for someone who knew how to read it. It hummed faintly against her palm, so faint she almost thought it was her imagination. Her heart pounded. She looked toward her bunkmate again, but the girl was still dead asleep, oblivious. Clara swallowed hard, slid the drive into the port on her tablet, and held her breath. The screen blinked to life. At first, nothing but black. Then text scrolled too fast to catch, lines of code flickering like lightning across a storm sky. Clara leaned closer, trying to read, but the words slipped past her comprehension, technical terms and numbers with no context. Then the screen froze. White letters pulsed against black, access request, echo shade terminal clearance. Civilian proxy engaged. Clara's eyes widened. She had never heard of echo shade. It sounded too official to be a prank, too precise to be random. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. Then she typed in her cadet credentials. The tablet shuddered. For a moment, she thought it might crash, but instead the words shifted again. Access logged. Oversight alert triggered. And then nothing. The screen went black, the tablet silent, the drive humming against her hand like the steady pulse of something alive. Clara yanked it free, her chest heaving, panic rushing through her veins. She stared at the drive in her hand, its smooth surface betraying nothing of what she had just unleashed. "What the hell was that?" she whispered into the darkness. Her bunkmate stirred, muttered something incoherent, then rolled over. Clara shoved the drive back into the bag, her fingers shaking so badly she almost dropped it. But sleep never came. Across town, I was already wide awake. The moment her credentials had touched that drive, my own secure device had lit up like a nerve struck raw. Alerts scrolled across the screen in red: unauthorized breach, internal node ping. Clearance tag R1A. My blood ran cold. That tag had been retired years ago, buried so deep it should never have seen light again. But there it was, screaming back to life. I sat up in bed, my room still cloaked in darkness, the only illumination coming from the device in my hand. I had built my life around silence, around erasing myself from every system that could expose me. And now the silence had broken. By the time I reached the command suite, the clock read 2:43. The building was windowless, sterile, lit only by the glow of monitors. Major Evelyn Shaw sat at the head of the table, her expression carved from ice. She slid a data pad across to me without preamble. "Commander Burke," she said, "we traced the signal. A proximity lock engaged on a Black Ops shell tied to Echo Shade. Someone used a legacy clearance path." I kept my face still, though the words dug deep. "It wasn't me." "That's what worries me," she replied. Her eyes never blinked. "You're issued 48 hours to trace and contain. Silent flag, no official report." She didn't wait for me to agree. She simply turned her gaze back to the monitors, dismissing me as though the conversation had ended. But it hadn't. Not for me. Back in my quarters, I decrypted the metadata manually, the code scrolling across my private terminal in jagged lines. Sloppy, amateurish, but familiar. Too familiar. The device signature matched the steel drive, the one I had left with Clara. I pressed my hands against the desk, my pulse hammering in my ears. She hadn't just stumbled into a locked door. She had stepped on a landmine, one I had spent years burying under layers of silence, and now it was awake. The question was not whether the system would notice. It already had. The question was who else would, because secrets like this never stay buried forever. I didn't go to Clara's barracks right away. Storming in at 3 in the morning would only make her dig deeper, only tighten her grip on the drive she didn't understand. Instead, I pulled every access log I could from the breach. The records were fragmented, lines of digital fingerprints half erased by age and encryption. Still, patterns emerged, repeated attempts buried in the code, dormant scripts like traps waiting for the wrong step, and at the center of it all, a name I hadn't allowed myself to think about in years. Victor Harlow. I leaned back in my chair, my breath shallow. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing closer, the hum of the terminal loud enough to suffocate. Victor had been a civilian contractor during my early years in Echo Shade. Brilliant with systems, too brilliant for his own good. He could weave code into mazes that even the sharpest analysts struggled to navigate. But brilliance comes with arrogance, and arrogance breeds rot. I had caught him injecting unauthorized sequences into the Echo simulations, scripts that didn't belong, backdoors no one else had noticed. I flagged him. I thought I ended it. He was quietly removed, vanished from the roster, his name scrubbed from files, or so I had believed. Now his signature lived in Clara's breach like a ghost, waiting for her to trip it. He hadn't just left traps, he had left them for me. I stared at the drive's metadata, at the timestamp that had woken it after all these years, and I realized the cruel symmetry. Victor hadn't counted on some foreign hacker stumbling across his graveyard of code. He had counted on Clara. A cadet too curious, too close to me, carrying the very drive I had slipped into her hands, a drive I had given her for protection, a drive he must have known I would never truly destroy. He had waited, patient, precise, until tonight. The realization burned hotter than the desert sun. He wasn't after Clara, he was after me, and she had just given him the perfect door. I shoved away from the desk, pacing the length of my quarters. Every step echoed louder than it should have, bouncing off the bare walls. My mind raced ahead of me, already building the possibilities. If Victor had left these scripts alive, then he had prepared evidence, enough to smear me, enough to paint me as a traitor, enough to unravel everything I had kept buried. My clearance, my name, my silence, all of it could collapse. The thought of Clara standing in the blast zone made my stomach twist. She had no idea what she had touched. To her, it was just a mystery, a puzzle tied to the sister she didn't understand. But to me, it was a live wire connected to the darkest parts of my past. At dawn, I requested a private room in the operations wing. Not a request, really. A command. They cleared it for me without hesitation. 2 hours later, Clara was escorted inside. She walked with the posture of a cadet trying too hard to seem unshaken, her jaw locked, her hands steady at her sides. But when she saw me waiting at the table and Sergeant Kane standing in the corner like a stone sentinel, her composure wavered. I pointed to the chair opposite mine. "Sit." She obeyed, but I saw the tension in her shoulders as she lowered herself onto the seat. Her eyes darted to Kane, then back to me. "You don't have to explain," I said evenly. "Not yet, but you need to understand what you've done." I held up the steel drive between my fingers. The faint hum of it filled the silence. Clara's eyes widened, guilt flashing across her face. "That wasn't just a file," I said. My voice stayed calm, but every word carried weight. "That was a federal security node tied to Echo Shade operations. What you triggered wasn't a drill. It was a tripwire designed to catch foreign actors, not curious sisters." Her lips parted. "I didn't mean—" "I know," I cut in, "but meaning doesn't undo the damage." She dropped her gaze, staring at her clenched fists on the table. "You have any idea what you touched?" I asked quietly. She shook her head. "That drive connects to files that don't exist on record, files that, if exposed, could compromise agents still in the field. You didn't open a door, Clara. You kicked a hole in a wall that was meant to stay sealed." She looked up then, her eyes sharp with hurt and confusion. "You're really all of this?" I didn't answer. Not directly. The silence was its own confession. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she whispered. "Because surviving sometimes requires silence," I said, "especially when no one ever asks." Kane's voice broke in, low and steady. "If she screws this up, Commander, both of you are finished." "I'm aware," I said, never looking away from Clara. Her eyes filled with a storm of emotions: anger, shame, fear, curiosity. But beneath it all, something else flickered. A resolve I had seen only in glimpses, back when she was a child trying to keep up with me in the woods behind our house. "I'm not reporting you," I said finally. Her eyes widened. "Why?" "Because you're going to help fix this." She froze. The weight of those words settled between us, heavier than any command, and then, slowly, she nodded. It was a small movement, cautious, hesitant, but it was enough. In that moment, we were no longer sisters standing on opposite sides of a broken story. We were co-conspirators standing at the edge of a storm neither of us had started, but both of us would have to finish it. The operations wing was never meant to feel human. Its walls were blank, its lighting fluorescent, its silence surgical. It was a place where secrets were dissected, catalogued, and buried again. No windows, no clocks. Time here belonged only to the people who pulled the strings. Clara sat beside me at the long table, her shoulders stiff, her eyes flicking nervously between the monitors and Sergeant Kane, who stood behind us like a sentry. She was a cadet among wolves, and she knew it. I slid the steel drive into the terminal, the hum of it vibrating through the table. The monitors came alive instantly, lines of code crawling upward in sharp white strokes. Clara leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "This is what you touched," I said. She swallowed. "It doesn't look like much." "That's because you don't know what you're seeing." The code shifted, reshaping itself into trees of data, branching pathways that twisted and doubled back on themselves. It was a labyrinth, alive and reactive. Kane crossed his arms. "This thing is bleeding into the system like an infection. If command catches wind—" "They won't," I said firmly. "Not yet." I tapped a sequence into the terminal, isolating the breach. The screen fractured, revealing a buried layer beneath the code. Encrypted, old. Clara tilted her head. "What's that?" I recognized the pattern instantly. A cold weight settled in my chest. A signature. The encryption wasn't random. It carried a rhythm, a deliberate structure I had seen before. The kind Victor Harlow had loved, intricate enough to intimidate, sloppy enough to disguise his arrogance as brilliance. Clara looked at me. "You know who did this?" I didn't answer. She pressed. "It's someone you knew, isn't it?" "Not someone I knew," I said quietly. "Someone I exposed." Kane's expression hardened. "You're telling me this is Harlow's work?" I nodded once. Clara frowned. "Who's Harlow?" I turned to face her fully, my voice flat. Victor Harlow was a civilian contractor. He designed interface systems for echo shade simulations. He was smart, too smart. He built paths no one else could see, and then he started using them for himself. Her eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" He injected code, unauthorized, hidden loops, backdoors. He was rewriting the rules without permission. When I caught him, I flagged it. He vanished from the program soon after. Officially, he was removed for performance issues. I paused. Unofficially, I thought they buried him. Clara sat back, her eyes wide. "But he's still here." "In the system, yes, and if this signature survived, then so did his plan." Kane stepped closer to the terminal, his jaw tight. "You're saying this breach wasn't random?" "Not even close." I tapped another sequence. The labyrinth of code shifted again, pulling us deeper into the buried layer. Hidden inside was a file signature disguised as a training log dated 5 years ago. My pulse jumped. I knew that date, that mission. Operation Halbert fiasco, the tribunal, the accusations, the whispers that I had covered up civilian deaths. The memory of it came back sharp, the chaos of the op, the sudden silence when comms went dead, the weight of lives balancing on orders I never gave. I had survived that storm once, barely, and now here it was again. Clara leaned closer, reading the masked file name. "What is it?" I clenched my fists. "It's a landmine. One he planted years ago, waiting for someone like you to trip it." Her face paled, so I didn't just trigger an alarm. "No," I said, "you triggered him." The room went still. Kane broke the silence. "What's his play? What does he want?" "He wants me exposed," I said. "He wants me erased in the light the way I erased him in the shadows, and now he has everything he needs to do it." Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. "Because of me?" I turned to her, meeting her eyes. "No, because of him. He set this in motion long before you were part of it. You just stepped where he wanted someone to step." Her jaw tightened. I saw the guilt pressing in on her, but beneath it something else flickered, determination. "Then let's close it," she said. Her words caught me off guard. For a moment, I saw not the cadet who had worshipped discipline, not the sister who had believed the family's stories about my failure. I saw someone standing on the edge of the same shadows I had lived in, reaching for them with steady hands. I nodded slowly. "We start with the logs." We spent hours combing through them, Clara beside me, Kane behind us like an immovable wall. Line after line of access pings scrolled across the screen. Most were dead ends, breadcrumbs leading nowhere. But then I found it, a cluster of entries tied to a fake contractor ID buried deep in the backup nodes. I froze. The encryption pattern was unmistakable. Victor Harlow had never disappeared. He had embedded himself, tucked away like rot under floorboards, waiting for the house to collapse. Kane exhaled through his teeth. Thought he was gone. He isn't, I said. Not until we burn him out of the system. Clara's voice was quiet but steady. How? I looked at her, at the steel in her eyes that reminded me of myself years ago, by rewriting the story before he does. Because this wasn't just about code. This was about truth, and Harlow had built a machine to erase it. But I wasn't going to let him, not this time. The longer we stared at the code, the less it felt like numbers and more like a map. Not a map of land or sea, but of intent. Every line carried purpose. Every loop carried malice. Harlow hadn't simply buried scraps of himself here. He had built a weapon, patient and precise, waiting for the right moment to detonate. Clara rubbed her temples, her tablet glowing in front of her. She had been scrolling through log after log, her lips pressed thin. Half of these entries are fake. Look, same timestamp, same IP mask, but slightly different signatures. I glanced over. She was right. The subtle inconsistencies were Harlow's style, sloppy brilliance. Kane leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, watching us both. If Command sees these, they'll assume you tried to cover your tracks, Commander. That's the point, I said. He built them to look like mine. Clara swallowed. So he's framing you. Not framing, I corrected. Rewriting. He's taken pieces of the truth and twisted them, filled the gaps with lies. To someone on the outside, it looks airtight. To someone on the inside, I let the sentence hang. It's poison. Clara sat back, exhaling hard. So what do we do? The question hit heavier than she realized. For years, my life had been built on silence, on surviving storms by never letting anyone else see me in them. Now here was my sister, demanding a role in the very storm I had tried to shield her from. We trace the root, I said finally. If we can prove his fingerprints, the story crumbles. Kane's jaw tightened. And if we can't, then I'll be standing in front of a tribunal with a noose already around my neck. The silence stretched long. Clara's hands clenched against the table, her nails digging crescents into her skin. I'll help. Her words carried no hesitation this time. I studied her face, the set of her jaw, the stubborn light in her eyes. She was no longer just the cadet desperate to live up to the family's praise. She was someone stepping willingly into the dark, even if she had no idea what it meant to live there. Fine, I said, but you follow my lead. Her nod was sharp, decisive. We dug deeper. Hours slipped past unnoticed, the fluorescent lights above us buzzing softly like they too were exhausted. The logs unfolded into patterns, clues disguised as noise. Every time we thought we had reached the end of a path, another fork opened, another signature flickered. At one point, Clara tapped the screen, her brow furrowed. This here, it's the same encryption, but the structure's different, like it was spliced. I leaned in. She was right again. The sequence had been lifted from another file entirely, jammed into place like a bone that didn't belong in the body. That's Harlow, I said, cutting and pasting to build his case. Kane spoke for the first time in an hour. He's not just trying to frame you, he's trying to erase himself. If everything points to you, then there's no one left to look at. Exactly. The realization settled like lead in my stomach. I closed the logs and pulled up the masked file we had uncovered earlier, the one tied to Operation Halbert. My throat tightened as the date blinked on the screen. That day had never left me. I remembered the chaos, the sudden silence when comms went dead, the faces of civilians who had wandered too close to the line of fire. I remembered giving the order to hold, to wait for confirmation, and I remembered the way the tribunal twisted it afterward, painting me as reckless, as complicit. Now Harlow was resurrecting it. Clara's voice broke through my thoughts. You were there, weren't you, on that mission? I nodded once. And you didn't do what they said? I met her eyes. No. I gave the order to hold fire. Someone else cut the line. She searched my face as if the truth might be written there. Finally, she whispered, it was him. Yes. The room fell silent again. Clara leaned back in her chair, her arms folded tightly across her chest. So he buried a landmine tied to that mission, knowing that if anyone touched it, it would look like you tried to erase your own mistakes. I exhaled slowly. He didn't want to just destroy me. He wanted to rewrite me. Kane shifted his weight, the floor creaking under his boots. So what's the next move? I stared at the humming steel drive still plugged into the terminal. Its faint glow pulsed like a heartbeat, patient and steady. The next move, I said, isn't about finding the file. It's about proving who planted it. If we can tie his hand to the code, we win. If not, I shook my head. He'll walk us straight into a tribunal, and this time I won't walk back out. Clara leaned forward, her voice firm. We find him, I studied her. For the first time, I realized she wasn't asking. She was deciding. The girl who had once lived in the glow of our family's praise was gone. Sitting beside me now was someone else entirely. Someone who had stepped into the shadows and wasn't planning to leave. And though part of me wanted to push her back into the light, another part, the part that had carried the silence for too long, was relieved. Because maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to carry it alone anymore. The deeper we dug, the more it felt like chasing shadows in a hall of mirrors. Harlow had been clever, too clever. He didn't just leave a single false trail, he had layered them, one over another, until truth and fiction blurred together like oil on water. The terminal hummed under my fingertips as I worked. Clara sat beside me, her tablet balanced on her knees, her eyes darting over logs with a focus I hadn't thought she was capable of. Kane stood near the door, arms crossed, his silent presence grounding us all. Hours slipped by, but the air in the operations room only grew heavier. Clara broke the silence first. It's like he's taunting us. I glanced at her screen. She was right. The code snippets she'd uncovered weren't just functional, they were theatrical. Obvious enough that someone would notice, but twisted enough that the wrong person would draw the wrong conclusion. That's his way, I said. He doesn't just want to win. He wants to humiliate, to leave you wondering if you ever had control at all. Clara shivered, though the room was warm. Kane finally spoke, his voice gravelly. He's baiting you, Commander, pulling you out into the open. I didn't argue, he was right, but staying silent wasn't an option anymore. I opened one of the masked files, forcing the encryption to unfurl. The screen filled with lines of text, logs from Operation Halbert. At least that's what they were meant to look like. Clara leaned closer. These don't match what you told me. They're not supposed to, I said. The logs claimed I had bypassed recon, that I had ordered the perimeter cleared without confirmation, that civilian casualties had been flagged and dismissed by my authority. It was meticulous, convincing, and entirely false. Clara's hands curled into fists. If I didn't know you, I'd believe this. That's what makes it dangerous. I pulled another layer of code, exposing the metadata beneath, and there it was. A faint digital fingerprint, a subroutine that didn't belong, Harlow's arrogance. He left this behind, I murmured, tapping the sequence. He couldn't resist, a flourish like a painter signing his work. Clara's eyes widened. So you can prove it's him? I hesitated. The fingerprint was faint, embedded so deeply it could be dismissed as coincidence. It wasn't enough, not yet. No, I admitted. Not to anyone who doesn't already want to believe me. Kane shifted. Then what's the play? I rubbed my temples, exhaustion clawing at me. The play is to drag him into the light before he drags me there. We need something undeniable, a key that ties his identity to this system, and the only way to find that is to follow the path he doesn't want us to see. Clara tilted her head. Which is? The places that don't match his arrogance, the places he tried too hard to hide. For the next hour, we followed that theory. Every time we spotted a sequence that looked sloppy, I ignored it. Instead, I chased the pieces that seemed too neat, too clean, code that blended so perfectly it was almost invisible, and then we found it, a cluster of entries tucked into a rarely used backup node, not just logs, audio fragments. Clara gasped softly. These are comms from Halbert, aren't they? Yes. My throat felt tight. I opened one. Static filled the speakers, then a voice, my voice. Hold fire. Possible civilian presence. Wait for recon confirmation. The room went still. Clara's eyes snapped to mine. Kane's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. That's the truth, Clara whispered. I nodded slowly. And it's the piece he couldn't erase, so he buried it instead. Kane uncrossed his arms, stepping closer to the terminal. If this gets out, it clears you. Not if he buries it again first, I said, because that was Harlow's endgame, to make sure no one ever heard that recording, to replace it with his version of history. Clara sat back, her breathing shallow. So this isn't just about you, it's about the truth itself. Yes, I let the word hang. And he knows that if the truth dies in silence, the lie becomes law. Kane's voice was low. Then we make sure it doesn't die. I studied the two of them, my sister, my old ally. Neither of them belonged in this storm. And yet, here they were. Clara's determination burned brighter than fear, and Kane's loyalty was unshakable, even when he didn't like the odds. For the first time in years, I realized I wasn't standing alone. But standing together came with a price. Harlow would know we were onto him, and he would strike first. The audio fragment looped in the background, my voice repeating the order to hold fire like a ghost desperate to be heard. Each time the static cut in, Clara's shoulders stiffened. She clutched her tablet close as if afraid the sound might vanish if she let go. "This is proof," she said firmly. "Anyone who hears this will know." "Not anyone," I corrected. "Only those who want the truth. For everyone else, it will look like a doctored clip. Harlow will spin it before it leaves this room." Kane folded his arms, his eyes never leaving the terminal. "So how do we get ahead of him?" I stared at the code still flickering across the screen. My pulse thudded in my ears. "We bait him," Clara frowned. "Bait. Harlow's biggest weakness is his arrogance. He wants me destroyed publicly, not quietly. He'll come running if he thinks he can watch me fall." "And you're willing to risk that?" Kane asked. "I've been risking it since the day I flagged him," I said. The silence that followed was heavy. Clara shifted in her seat, her knuckles white around her tablet. "What if it doesn't work?" "Then he wins," I admitted. "And we all go down with me." Kane's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He had been in enough operations to know that sometimes the only way forward was through fire. I leaned forward, entering a new sequence into the terminal. The code shimmered, reshaping into a false access log. "We leave a trail, something sloppy, something he can't resist. He'll think I made a mistake, and when he comes to exploit it, we'll trace him back." Clara's eyes widened. "You're setting a trap." "Yes," I said, "and he'll never be able to resist stepping into it." For the next several hours, we worked in near silence. I built the bait carefully, crafting a set of corrupted files that looked like attempts to wipe the Halbert logs. Not convincing enough to fool a tribunal, but enough to tempt Harlow into fixing them. Clara sat beside me, watching intently, her questions sharp but measured. Kane kept watch near the door, his hand never far from the weapon at his hip. When the trap was finished, I leaned back in my chair. The room smelled faintly of ozone, the air heavy with exhaustion and adrenaline. "It's done," I said. "Now we wait." Clara exhaled, rubbing her temples. "How long?" "Minutes, hours, doesn't matter. He'll see it, and he won't be able to ignore it." The three of us sat in silence, the glow of the monitors casting long shadows on the walls. At 3:17 a.m., the first ping came. Clara jumped. "Was that?" "Yes," I said, already leaning forward. The screen lit up with a new signature. "Clean, precise, too precise, Harlow." "He's in," I whispered. Kane moved closer, his presence heavy at my back. "Track him." I typed furiously, tracing the pathways he opened. His code slid through the system like a blade through water, cutting and reshaping logs with surgical precision. He thought he was alone, unseen, but we were right behind him. "There," Clara said suddenly, pointing. "That subroutine, he's routing through a dead contractor ID." I smiled grimly. He always did love his ghosts. I followed the path, isolating the signal. My screen filled with cascading numbers, each one narrowing the net. And then, for the briefest moment, his real location flickered across the terminal. Clara gasped. "Did you see that?" "Yes," I said, my chest tight. "We've got him." But just as quickly, the signal vanished, buried under layers of encryption. Kane cursed under his breath. "He knows he's being watched." I shook my head. "Not yet, that was instinct. He thinks he covered his trail. He doesn't know we already caught his shadow." Clara leaned forward, her eyes burning. "So what do we do now?" I closed the terminal, the hum of it fading into silence. "Now we prepare. He'll come harder next time, faster. He'll want to finish it before we can move." Kane's voice was low. "And when he does," I looked at both of them, Clara trembling but resolute, Kane steady as stone. "Then," I said, "we strike back." The weight of the words settled over us. The storm wasn't coming, it was already here. But for the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for it alone. Clara and Kane were in it with me, and together we were going to drag Victor Harlow out of his shadows and into the light, no matter what it cost. The next morning, the base felt different. The corridors hummed with a nervous energy, the kind that spreads without words. Soldiers marched sharper, their eyes darting at shadows they couldn't name. I walked with Clara at my side, Kane trailing behind like an anchor. We didn't speak. There was no need. The night's discovery still clung to us, the weight of Harlow's presence heavy in the air. By the time we reached the operations wing, my chest was already tight. I logged into the secure terminal, half expecting to see nothing, half dreading what I knew would be waiting. The screen lit up instantly. Dozens of logs flooded the system. Each one stamped with my clearance tag, each one implicating me in breaches that hadn't even happened yet. Clara gasped. "How? He's accelerating," I cut in. My voice was calm, but inside my pulse thundered. "He knows we're onto him." Kane's eyes narrowed. "He's trying to drown you before you can swim." The false logs were perfect. Too perfect. Not the sloppy arrogance we'd tracked before, but a new kind of precision. He was adapting. He knew we'd seen his signature, and he was burying it under flawless fabrications. Clara's voice trembled. "If Command sees these, they'll believe every word," I finished for her. "Because why wouldn't they? The logs were airtight, the timestamps lined up, the clearance tags matched mine exactly. To anyone outside this room, I was guilty before the trial even began. I exhaled slowly, forcing calm into my voice. This is the breaking point. He's not just testing us anymore, he's making his move. Clara stared at me, her eyes wide with fear. Then what do? I leaned forward, my hands steady against the table. We hold our ground. He wants me to panic, to make a mistake. We don't give him that satisfaction. But even as I said it, I felt the ground shifting under me, because the truth was I had already made a mistake. I had underestimated him. Kane's voice cut through my thoughts. Commander, you need to see this. He pointed to the corner of the screen. My heart sank. A tribunal request had already been filed, not from Shaw, not from the chain of command. Anonymous. Clara paled. That means he's inside, I said. My voice was flat, not just in the system, in the command structure. The room felt colder suddenly, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like flies on a corpse. Clara's voice broke. If he has people in command, then this isn't just about me, I said. This is about Echo Shade itself, and if he wins, the entire program collapses. Kane's jaw tightened. Or worse, he takes control of it. The thought sent a chill through me. Echo Shade wasn't just data. It was a living archive of operations, simulations, secrets. In the wrong hands, it could rewrite history. It could rewrite reality. And Harlow had always been obsessed with control. Clara's voice rose, panicked. So we're just supposed to sit here and wait for him to erase you? No, I said firmly. We hit back harder. Her eyes widened. How? We expose him before the tribunal meets. Not just hints, not just fingerprints, undeniable proof. Clara's hands trembled against the table. And if we fail, then I take the fall, I said simply. Alone. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Clara shook her head violently. No, not alone. This started with me. I touched that drive. I triggered him. You didn't build him, I said. I did. When I flagged him, I thought I ended it. I didn't. That's on me. Her voice cracked. You can't keep carrying all of this yourself. For a moment, I almost told her the truth, that carrying it alone was the only way I'd survived this long. But when I looked at her, at the fire in her eyes despite the fear, I realized she was already in too deep to be pushed back out. Kane broke the silence, his tone steady. If you're going to bring him down, you'll need leverage, something he can't erase, something physical. I nodded slowly. He was right. Digital trails could be rewritten. But physical evidence, hard drives, old terminals, classified reports, that was harder to erase completely. And if I knew Harlow, he would have kept something, a trophy, proof of his genius. Clara straightened, her fear sharpening into determination. Then we find it. I studied her face, the stubborn line of her jaw. She reminded me so much of myself at her age that it hurt, but I couldn't deny she was right. Harlow left a shadow, I said quietly. And somewhere out there, he left a body to cast it. We find that, and we end this. The room fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It was electric. The storm was closing in, but for the first time, I felt like we were running toward it, not away, because the breaking point wasn't just his. It was mine, and I wasn't going to break alone. The tribunal request spread through the base like wildfire. Rumors grew legs before sunrise. Officers who once gave me curt nods now averted their eyes. Cadets whispered when I passed, their curiosity sharpened by fear. My name had become currency again, only now it bought suspicion instead of respect. Clara walked beside me through the corridors, her chin lifted high, but I saw her fists clenched tight at her sides. Kane followed, his gaze sweeping every corner, every shadow. We were together, but each of us carried our own weight. By the time we reached the operations wing, Major Evelyn Shaw was waiting. Her presence alone stiffened the air. Commander Burke, she said, her voice sharp enough to slice through steel. Explain. She slid a datapad across the table. Dozens of access logs glowed on the screen, all branded with my clearance tag, all damning. Clara bristled. Those are fakes. Silence, cadet, Shaw snapped, her eyes never leaving mine. I didn't flinch. She's right. Shaw's jaw tightened. Do you have proof? Not yet, I admitted. I will. The words hung in the room, reckless and raw. Shaw's gaze bored into me. Finally, she said, you have until the tribunal convenes, 48 hours. If you can't prove these logs are falsified, I won't be able to shield you. She turned sharply and left, her boots echoing against the floor like a gavel. Clara exhaled shakily. She doesn't believe you. She doesn't need to, I said. She just needs proof, and so do we. Kane leaned against the wall, his voice steady. Where do we find it? I stared at the glowing logs. The code was too clean, too sharp. Harlow had outgrown the arrogance that had betrayed him before, but even perfection leaves a shadow. He wouldn't risk building this from nothing, I murmured. He'd need an anchor, a physical node, somewhere he could operate without being traced. Clara frowned. Like a server. More than that, I said. A sanctuary. He'd want a place no one would question, where he could work in silence. Kane's eyes narrowed. You know where? I closed my eyes, the memory hitting like a hammer. Yes. Years ago, when Harlow had still been a contractor, he had an office buried under the East Wing. It had been decommissioned after his removal officially. Unofficially, I had always suspected he'd kept a back door into it. If I was right, that room still held his fingerprints. Clara straightened. Then let's go. Her eagerness caught me off guard. It won't be safe. I don't care, she said. You need me. He's after both of us now. Kane gave me a look. He didn't say a word, but his silence carried a weight. She's not wrong, I exhaled. Fine, but you follow orders, both of you? They nodded. We moved through the base like ghosts, avoiding crowded corridors, sticking to the service tunnels. My heart pounded with every step, the weight of time pressing hard. 48 hours. That was all we had. When we reached the East Wing, the air grew colder. The lights flickered, casting long shadows against the concrete walls. Most of this sector had been abandoned for years, its doors sealed, its corridors dusty with neglect. But when we reached the old sublevel, one door hummed faintly with power. Clara whispered, "He's here." "Not here," I said, "but this is his echo." Kane stepped forward first, testing the panel. The door slid open with a groan, revealing a room bathed in dim blue light. Dust coated the floor, but the terminal at the center glowed like it had never been touched by time. We entered slowly. The air smelled faintly metallic, like burnt wires. I approached the terminal, my pulse racing. The screen lit up at my touch. Lines of code cascaded across it, familiar, sharp, venomous. Clara hovered at my shoulder. "That's him, isn't it?" "Yes," I whispered. Kane moved to the far corner, scanning the shadows. "If this is a trap..." "It is," I said, "but it's also proof." I tapped the keys, pulling the logs into view. Unlike the polished forgeries flooding the main system, these were raw, messy. Full of the arrogance Harlow had once flaunted, and woven through them was his unmistakable signature. Clara leaned closer, her breath catching. "So this clears you?" "Not yet," I said. "We have to extract it, and he'll know the second we try." Kane's voice was grim. "Then make it fast." I slid the steel drive into the terminal, beginning the transfer. The screen pulsed with warnings, alarms muted but insistent. Clara whispered, "He knows." "Yes," I said, "and now he's coming." The lights flickered again, dimming until the room was nearly dark. The hum of the terminal grew louder, like a heartbeat quickening, and then the screen shifted. Not code, not logs, words. "Hello, Daisy," Clara gasped. Kane's hand went to his weapon. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering. For the first time in years, I felt his presence not as a ghost, but as something alive. Victor Harlow was here, and the game had just changed. The glow of the terminal painted the room in shades of blue and white, shadows stretching across the abandoned office like specters. Clara's breath came quick and shallow beside me. Kane stood still, his hand hovering just above his sidearm, though we all knew bullets couldn't kill what we were facing. The words on the screen pulsed. "Hello, Daisy," I forced my breathing steady. "Victor." The cursor blinked and then more text appeared. "Took you long enough. I thought you'd forgotten me." Clara whispered, "He's talking to you?" "Yes," I said quietly. My voice was calm, but inside I felt the familiar burn of his presence. This was exactly his game, not just to corner me, but to make me feel his shadow. The screen shifted again. "You should have left it buried. You always had a problem with silence." I clenched my fists. "You framed me. You turned my orders into lies." The reply was instant. "I didn't frame you. I improved you. I gave them the Daisy Burke they already believed in. Reckless. Ruthless. Easier to hate, easier to erase." Clara stepped forward, anger sparking in her eyes. "You ruined her life, for what?" The cursor paused before responding. "For balance. She erased me first. Do you know what it's like to be deleted by someone you trusted? To have your brilliance buried because it scared the cowards around you? Daisy made sure I vanished. This is justice." The words cut deep, but not because they were true, because of how much of his madness I recognized. His genius had always been poisoned by grievance. He could never accept limits, never accept accountability. I typed quickly. "Justice doesn't hide in shadows. Justice doesn't fabricate evidence. Neither does survival." The lights above us flickered violently, buzzing like hornets. The air grew heavy, the hum of the terminal deepening into a low vibration that rattled the floor. Clara grabbed my arm. "What's happening?" "He's escalating," I said. "He's trying to destabilize the entire sublevel system." Kane's voice was hard. "He'll bring the whole base down if he has to." The screen flooded with new text. I don't need the base, I just need the story, and right now the story belongs to me. I slammed my hands against the keys, pulling up the raw logs we had uncovered earlier. The screen split, his forgeries on one side, the buried recordings on the other, two realities clashing on the same canvas. Clara leaned closer, her eyes wide. Can you push the truth out? Maybe, I said, if I can anchor it before he erases it again. Kane stepped forward. Do it, we'll hold the line. I wasn't sure what he meant by that until the alarms blared overhead. A sharp, piercing wail filled the corridors, red emergency lights flashing in rhythm. Clara's eyes went wide. He triggered the lockdown. Kane drew his weapon, his face grim. Then he's not alone. The door to the sublevel slammed shut with a metallic clang, sealing us in. The room shook faintly as automated defenses came online. I typed faster, my fingers flying across the keys. He's trying to flush us out. He knows if I can stabilize the logs, the truth survives. The terminal hissed, sparks flying as the drive hummed violently. The room smelled of burning plastic. Clara pressed closer. Tell me what to do. I hesitated for only a second, then pointed to the auxiliary terminal. Run a manual backup. Copy every fragment you can before he wipes it. Don't stop no matter what. She nodded sharply, moving to the other side of the room. Her hands shook, but her resolve was iron. Kane positioned himself by the door, his weapon raised, his eyes scanning the shadows. The screen erupted again. You can't win, Daisy. Even if you dig up the truth, no one will believe it. They already hate you. They want me to be right. I typed furiously. Then why are you afraid? The cursor froze. For a long moment, no reply came. Then slowly, because you taught me how dangerous silence can be, my chest tightened. For years I had lived by silence, wielded it as both shield and weapon, and now he had twisted it into his own arsenal. The logs on the screen flickered, half erasing, half reforming. My voice, my real orders, cut in and out, tangled with his forged ones. Truth and lies bled together until they were nearly indistinguishable. Clara's voice rose from across the room. I've got fragments. It's messy, but it's real. Hold on to them, I shouted. That's our proof. The lights flickered again, plunging us into near darkness. Kane fired a shot into the ceiling, the sound deafening in the confined space. Stay focused, he barked. I leaned closer to the terminal, my face lit by the glow. My pulse pounded in time with the hum of the drive. This was it. The storm Victor had been building for years, crashing down in one suffocating wave, and I wasn't sure if any of us would walk out of it. The room trembled as the system screamed against itself. Red emergency lights pulsed like a heartbeat, throwing our shadows across the cracked walls. The air was thick with the smell of overheated circuits and dust long undisturbed. Clara's voice cut through the chaos. I've stabilized 3 fragments. They're rough, but they prove you order to hold. Keep going, I shouted, my hands still flying across the keys. The terminal's screen split again, Victor's forged logs colliding with my commands in real time. One side, his story, me reckless complicit. On the other, the buried fragments of truth clawing their way back to life. Kane braced at the door as it rattled under pressure. We've got movement outside. Of course we did. Victor wouldn't rely on code alone. He'd planted his hands in the command structure, and now those hands were reaching for us. The screen flared white, then words appeared again, taunting, sharp. You think proof matters? People don't want truth. They want stories, and mine is better. Cleaner, I typed back, my breath ragged. A story doesn't outlast the truth, it only delays it. The reply came instantly, then you'll die waiting. The system buckled under his assault. Code roared across the screen like a flood, drowning out the fragments Clara had pulled. My fingers ached as I fought to anchor them to keep them alive just a moment longer. Then the hum of the steel drive shifted, higher, faster. It was reaching critical. Clara's voice cracked with urgency. If it fries, we lose everything. I knew she was right, but pulling it now meant letting Victor wipe the slate clean. Kane's weapon barked once, the deafening shot silencing even the alarms for a heartbeat. Commander, he roared, decide. And in that instant, I saw it clearly. The only way to end this wasn't to fight Victor in silence. It was to force him into the open. Clara, I barked, mirror the fragments onto the public node. Now, her eyes widened in shock. That's everyone will see it? Exactly. For a split second, hesitation flickered across her face. Then it was gone. She slammed the command into her tablet, her fingers moving with a speed born of desperation. The room lit up as the fragments leapt from the hidden terminal onto the base's public feed. Screens across Fort Armitage would be flickering now with my real voice, hold fire. Possible civilian presence. Wait for recon confirmation. Victor's reply appeared instantly, furious. "You reckless fool, you've doomed yourself. They'll never trust fragments. They'll call them doctored, you'll still fall." I leaned close to the terminal, my voice steady despite the chaos. "Maybe, but now they'll know there's another story, and they'll start asking questions." For the first time, the cursor hesitated. Kane glanced back at us. The door behind him buckled once, twice. "We're out of time," the drive shrieked, sparks flying as its casing glowed hot. Clara ripped it free with a cry, tossing it onto the floor just as smoke curled from its seams. The screens went dark. Silence fell, thick and suffocating, broken only by the thud of boots on the other side of the door. Then the emergency lights flickered back to white. The system rebooted, slowly, painfully. And when the terminals came online, the fragments were still there. Broadcast, saved, untouchable. Clara collapsed into the chair, her chest heaving. "We did it." I wasn't so sure. Victor hadn't lost, not yet. He had retreated, forced back into shadow, but shadows were where he thrived. Still, for the first time, the truth had a voice. The door burst open, soldiers flooding the room with weapons drawn. Shaw pushed through them, her eyes sharp as blades. "What the hell happened here?" she demanded. Kane lowered his weapon but didn't step aside. "We've got proof, Major. Proof that Harlow, behind the breach. Proof that Commander Burke's orders were falsified." Shaw's eyes flicked to me, then to Clara, then to the smoldering drive on the floor. "Is it enough?" she asked coldly. I met her gaze. It's enough to ask questions, and once the questions start, the lies don't hold. For a long moment, she held my eyes, then she gave the faintest nod. "Then you'd better be ready to finish this," she said. The soldiers filed out. Shaw followed, leaving the three of us alone again in the wreckage. Clara leaned her head against the chair, exhaustion written across her face. Kane holstered his weapon, his expression unreadable. I stood there, the hum of the dead drive still ringing in my ears. The war wasn't over. Victor Harlow was still out there, buried deep in the shadows. But for the first time in years, I wasn't silent. For the first time, the truth was louder than the lies, and I would keep it that way, no matter what it cost.